There's a skyscraper in Manhattan that cost more than $2 billion to build. At 1,428 feet tall, it's the thinnest skyscraper ever constructed in human history. The engineering alone pushed concrete, steel, and physics to their absolute limits, and yet most of it sits empty. Not because it failed, not because it fell, but because almost nobody who can afford to live there actually wants to. That is the story of Steinway Tower. And the real question was never whether this building could stand. The engineers solved that. The question is whether it was ever meant to be a home. Let's find out. To understand why this building exists, you need to understand where it stands. Right along the southern edge of Central Park sits a stretch of Manhattan known as Billionaire's Row. Not an official address, a nickname. Because starting around 2013, developers stopped competing to build wide and started competing to build thin. The logic was simple. A small footprint means a small land cost. A tall, thin tower means maximum apartments at maximum height. And on Billionaire's Row, height means views. Views over Central Park that no wider building can block. That was the pitch. But Steinway Tower took the idea further than anyone had ever gone before. The building's base measures just 59 by 75 feet. That footprint is smaller than an NBA basketball court, and from it, this tower rises 1,428 feet into the sky. That puts it in a category called super tall, buildings that exceed 1,000 feet and represent the absolute outer edge of what structural engineering can produce. There are fewer than 200 of them on Earth, and with a height-to-width ratio of 24:1, this one is the thinnest ever built. For comparison, 432 Park Avenue, another Billionaire's Row tower already infamous for its own structural problems, has a ratio of 15:1. Steinway Tower is 60% more extreme. But before a single floor went up, the engineers had to solve a problem most people would never think of. Because the obvious fear when you look at a building this thin is that it tips over. That is not actually the hard problem. The hard problem is that it was trying to pull itself out of the ground. Here is what that means. When wind hits a tall, thin building, the forces don't just push horizontally. They travel down through the structure and create what engineers call uplift, a vertical pulling force at the base. In an extreme case, it's like trying to yank the building straight up out of the earth. A wide skyscraper has enough mass spread across enough ground to resist that. Its own weight keeps it planted. Steinway Tower does not. Its footprint is tiny. There's nowhere near enough weight at its base to hold against the forces generated at the top. So engineers drilled nearly 200 steel anchors up to 100 feet into Manhattan's bedrock. Each one a giant bolt connecting the building's foundation to solid rock. Together, they function like the roots of a tree, holding the structure against forces that would otherwise tear it free. And that was just to solve the ground problem. Above ground, a far more dangerous force was waiting. Wind at 1,400 feet is not just strong. It behaves in a way that can destroy a building from the inside. There is a phenomenon called vortex shedding. When wind flows around a tall, thin structure, it doesn't pass cleanly on both sides. Instead, it wraps around the edges and creates spinning pockets of air that alternate, left side releases, then right side, over and over in a rhythm. Each release gives the building a small sideways push, left, then right, then left again. On a short building, you don't feel it. On a 1,400-foot needle, that rhythm builds into a sway the people inside can feel. And in the worst case, if the frequency of those vortices matches the building's natural frequency, the motion amplifies with every cycle. It's the same reason soldiers are told never to march in step across a bridge. Engineers had 3 weapons against it, and they used all 3 at the same time. Weapon 1 was the building's shape. The edges are stepped and feathered, disrupting airflow before it can organize into a steady pattern. Weapon 2 was the facade. The entire exterior is wrapped in hand-laid terracotta tiles. That rough, uneven surface creates microscale turbulence the moment wind touches it. Turbulent air is chaotic, and chaotic air cannot build the alternating rhythm that causes dangerous sway. Weapon 3 was the most radical. On the 51st, 71st, and 86th floors, entire sections of the building are left completely open. Not rooms, not mechanical flaws, but gaps. Wind passes straight through rather than building pressure against a solid wall. 3 floors open to the sky, built into the price of stability. At the very top sits an 800-ton tuned mass damper, a massive block of steel suspended on hydraulics that shifts opposite to the building's movement, counteracting the sway before it reaches the floors below. This was not the first time Manhattan had to fight this problem. In 1978, the Citicorp Center came terrifyingly close to collapse when a Princeton architecture student, writing her thesis, discovered that diagonal wind gusts could topple the entire building. The fix was a secret overnight retrofit, engineers reinforcing over 200 joints while tenants slept. At 24-1, Steinway Tower is nearly twice as slender as Citicorp was. Every solution had to be pushed to the absolute limit. By the time the engineering was solved on paper, construction had already started to unravel. In October 2020, Hurricane Zeta hit New York City while the tower was still being built. The crane at the top, hundreds of feet above Midtown, got caught in the storm. The crane ball, a massive steel counterweight, broke free and began to swing. The footage is deeply unsettling. A weight the size of a car swinging in slow, enormous arcs above the Manhattan skyline. Then it hit the building. It punched into the facade, causing structural damage on a project already bleeding time and money. More delays, more costs on a budget already stretched past the breaking point. Not long after opening in 2022, it made headlines again for a very different reason. A chunk of ice fell from the upper floors and struck a driver on the street below. The person survived, but the story ran everywhere. The world's thinnest skyscraper, this engineering triumph on Billionaires Row, was now being reported as a falling debris hazard in the middle of Midtown Manhattan. That was when the financial picture finally came into full view. The project had been over-leveraged from the beginning. In 2017, while the tower was still under construction, developers defaulted on a $325 million loan. One investor, Airbase Corporation, lost its entire stake and spent years fighting in court to recover anything. By 2019, lenders were threatening full foreclosure. By 2023, Apollo Real Estate had to write off $82 million just to close the chapter and move on. When sales did happen, the numbers told their own story. A unit originally listed at $14.2 million sold for $1.75 million. In the early years, units sold at discounts of 6 to 17% below asking. By 2024, to get the building moving again, those cuts had deepened to 15, 20, even 40% off the original prices. The development cycled through 3 different sales teams in 6 years. By 2023, just a year after completion, most of the tower stood empty. At night, floor after floor sat dark. The building earned a nickname that has followed it ever since, the Ghost Tower. But the emptiness was never entirely a surprise. Across Billionaires Row, nearly half of all luxury units sit unused. They were never really meant to be homes. They were investment vehicles. A place for global wealth to park money rather than live. Russian oligarchs, Middle Eastern royalty, Chinese billionaires were always the target buyer. Not families looking for a place to sleep, not people who needed a home. While those towers rose and those floors sat dark, the rest of New York was living through a very different reality. A housing shortage pushing average rents to record highs, while a $2 billion skyscraper stood mostly empty in the middle of Midtown. The tallest safe deposit box ever built, designed for assets instead of people. Now, say you ignored all that. You had the money, you signed the paperwork. What do you actually get? The views are, without exaggeration, extraordinary. On a clear day, you can see the full length of Central Park from above, the Hudson to the west, the East River to the east, the city grid spreading to every horizon. The building contains just 59 units in total, 45 in the tower and 14 in the historic Steinway Hall base below. Each apartment is a full floor. Private elevator opens directly into your home. Bathrooms finished in Italian marble, kitchens in bronze and rare wood. There is an 82-foot indoor lap pool, a private barbershop, a shoe shine stand. Wait, An 82-foot pool in a building with a 59-foot base? The math does not work, and it doesn't. Several floors of the historic base were combined to create the amenity level, a small reminder that the numbers behind this building have always been more complicated than they appear. Here is what the brochure does not tell you. When the wind picks up, the building moves. Not a vibration, not a subtle tremor, a long, slow sway, like standing on the deck of a ship in a gentle swell. The engineering worked exactly as designed, but living through it, night after night, is something the design drawings never had to account for. Residents have described hearing the building creak and groan as wind loads shift. Steel and concrete flexing under stress make noise. That's the structure doing precisely what it was built to do. But lying in bed at 2 a.m. listening to your home groan like the hull of a ship? That is not an experience most people pay $50 million to have. The elevators travel so far and so fast that pressure changes in the shaft create their own sensations during every ride. Getting water to the upper floors requires pumping systems powerful enough to overcome the height differential, and those systems are not quiet. And in a real emergency, a fire, a medical crisis on the 80th floor, you are an enormous distance from the ground, with no elevator and a very long stairwell. Engineers solved the glamorous problem. How do you make a 1,400-foot needle stand? They solved it completely. But the unglamorous problem? How do you make it a place where human beings can actually live? Was never really the center of the brief. One structural engineer watching from the outside said it best, "This building both amazes and frightens me, not because it will fall, because it was built for a world that does not quite exist." There are signs of recovery. In 2024, more than 15 units sold for a combined $263 million, with another $127 million under contract. By 2026, after nearly a decade of discounts and 3 sales teams, the building is finally approaching sellout. The ghost tower is no longer entirely dark. But the reputation has not shifted. For many New Yorkers, Steinway Tower remains exactly what it looks like from the street. A monument to the idea that ambition and livability are not the same thing. The most resonant comment left under almost every video about this building says it simply, just because you can, doesn't mean you should. Steinway Tower is a genuine engineering achievement. The problems its builders solved had never been solved at this scale before. It stands, it will keep standing. But when you ask whether you would actually want to live inside it, sway, sounds, pressure, ice falling, isolation and all, the answer for almost everyone is the same. So, would you? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about buildings pushing engineering to its absolute edge, subscribe. We post every single week.